I would now like to introduce Senator Mark Kelly from Arizona and invite him to the stage. Senator Kelly has served his country as a U.S. Navy combat pilot, a NASA astronaut, and now as a U.S. Senator from Arizona, where he has brought a scientific viewpoint and data-driven approach to policymaking. Senator Kelly flew combat jets for the Navy during Operation Desert Storm before joining the space program and NASA in 1996, where he made 4 trips in the space shuttle. He retired from NASA in 2011 after commanding Space Shuttle Endeavour on its final flight. Senator Kelly is married to former Congresswoman Gabby Gifford, and they live in Tucson. Welcome, Senator.
Thank you, Aaron, and great to see everybody this morning. Myself and Nick on my team, who many of you know, we got in rather late last night. Sat on the runway at BWI. I was a little late getting out of the Senate chamber as we tried to get this defense bill done and a continuing resolution, both successful, by the way. Last week I was presiding, and when you sit at the dais, there's a Bible there. And not always, but I'll often open up the Bible and read a passage. And I was looking at Exodus the other day, and Exodus, I felt, is somewhat related to what all of us do here in this conference, in a way. So bear with me for a second. So as Pharaoh is chasing Moses through the desert towards the Red Sea, God looks down on Moses and says, "I've got good news and bad news. Which do you want first?" And Moses says, "Well, I'll take the good news." And God says, "Well, Moses, I'm going to allow you to part the Red Sea and escape Pharaoh and his army." He says, "Well, great. Okay, well, what's the bad news?" And he says, "Well, you're going to have to do the NEPA process." I've learned a lot about the NEPA process. Some stuff we do in government, very important, not like the Navy or NASA. But it is an honor for me to be here at this annual conference of the Colorado River Water Users Association. In a moment, you will all hear from senior officials from the U.S. Department of Interior, from the Bureau of Reclamation, from the International Boundary and Water Commission, and representatives from Mexico. But for now, I want to update you on some recent actions by Congress and share my perspective on this drought crisis. So I'll begin by saying this. Washington has a vested interest in the basin's resilience to drought. And as someone who never planned to run for elected office, I often analyze, big challenges using my background as a pilot and an astronaut and as an engineer. Fittingly, tomorrow marks 21 years since I returned home from my first mission into space aboard Space Shuttle Endeavour. Now that mission gave me a totally different perspective, literally, on the Colorado River. I remember looking on that mission out the flight deck windows early in the mission, and I see this large mountain range as we're coming over California. And I asked my boss, the Space Shuttle Commander, Dom Gorey, I said, "What mountains are those?" And he said, "Hey, that's not a mountain. That's a big hole in the ground." Turns out it was the Colorado River running through the Grand Canyon. From space, does not look like a hole in the ground. And I'll never forget that moment, looking down from space at the Colorado River carving its way through the west. Before I was elected to the Senate, I spent 25 years serving in the Navy, 15 of those at NASA. Now, these jobs required a very technical, yet pretty broad set of knowledge and skills. But I have to say, while I bring that education and experience to this job, I've learned that water policy is rather complicated. I feel it's actually one of the more complicated things that I've had to deal with while in the United States Senate. So very early, before I was even sworn in, this is one of those topics that I took very seriously, and I felt I really needed to learn a lot. So that's why over the past few years, I spent time meeting with and listening to the people who work with water for a living, farmers, businesses, tribal communities, water experts, and federal, state, and local agencies. Some of those folks, many of you, are here today. And I've talked with my Senate colleagues and governors from the upper and lower basins. I've convened and chaired committee hearings on Western drought. And in my first 6 months in the Senate, I got to work on this. I mean, negotiating with both Republicans and Democrats to secure $8.3 billion in the bipartisan infrastructure law for Western water infrastructure and ecosystem restoration. $3 billion of that is already repairing leaking dams and canals across the West. This is all to say that I've spent the last 2 years making sure that Washington pays attention to this basin. Now, my colleagues have come to learn that every week I check the water elevations in both Lake Mead and Lake Powell, every week. You know, they're about 1/4 full now, storing much less water today than they did on that space shuttle mission 21 years ago. Back in 2001, Lake Powell's lowest elevation was 3,657 feet above sea level. Next year, Powell's projected high point will be 115 feet lower. Lake Mead's lowest elevation in 2001 was 1,117 feet. Next year, Mead will top out at 1,046 feet. 2 decades of below-average runoff and drier soil means that the basin faces an annual deficit of 2 to 4 million acre-feet. So that's why we're all here. Whether your water is sourced by compact or contract or treaty or decree, it is not in anyone's interest to allow the Colorado River system to crash. I mean, there are a lot of reasons for that. Our shared use of the Colorado River supports the quality of life that we enjoy today. Together, the basin grows over 100 million tons of vegetables and forage every year, from Colorado to Yuma to the Imperial Irrigation District. This abundance feeds the nation and fuels economies within our 7 states and Mexico. Tourism and outdoor recreation from the river generates billions of dollars in economic activity annually. And as our population grows, the importance of protecting the system grows too. Some may differ on the solutions, but we know that inaction is not the answer. And insufficient action will mean serious consequences for the entire basin. Because if a solution is not developed by the basin, Commissioner Tootin is going to figure it out for us. And as much as I enjoy working with the commissioner, I think it's better for everyone if the federal government doesn't make these tough decisions. That sentiment is shared by many of my Senate colleagues. No matter what basin state we represent, we all want water users to take the lead here. When the Inflation Reduction Act was introduced earlier this year, folks across the country praised it as a major step towards addressing climate change. But after reading the draft bill, it was clear that funding for Western drought, it was just left out. That's when I spoke to Senator Manchin about this and told him that we can't have a climate bill that doesn't address Western drought. I told him we needed to include resources for mitigation and system conservation. Then I encouraged my colleagues from other Western states to reach out and do the same thing. Senator Manchin initially came back with an offer of $1 billion. But that wasn't enough for a problem this size. It just wasn't. I told him about the hydrology and sublimation and the different tiers in the lower basin drought contingency plan. And we spoke about, how the Hoover Dam and Glen Canyon Dam were nearing minimum power pool. And we talked about food prices. And I told him how farmers in Yuma produce about 90% of the nation's winter lettuce. Ultimately, Senator Manchin agreed, and the Inflation Reduction Act was signed into law with $4 billion for drought mitigation. And it was prioritized for the Colorado River Basin. That's what the law says. Of course, this funding isn't enough to solve a drought that spans decades and half the United States. Perhaps no amount of federal funding can do that. But it can soften the blow and help water users conserve water in Lake Mead and Lake Powell. And it's what I mean when I say that Washington wants the basin to find a solution. Now, I believe that Congress can and should do more. The federal government has a unique relationship with 33 sovereign tribal governments in the basin, and Arizona is home to 22 of them. Now, many hold significant rights and claims to water. Quantifying those rights and empowering tribes to conserve should be one of our priorities. This year, I introduced a bill that allows a tribe in Arizona to do just that. The Colorado River Indian Tribes, or the CRWUA, is a tribe located on the banks of the river in western Arizona. And a Supreme Court judgment gives them rights to more than 600,000 acre-feet of water in the state of Arizona. Now, CRWUA, they use hand-dug flood irrigation canals, a system that was built by the Bureau of Indian Affairs more than 100 years ago. Now, I spent time in the CRWUA community. Last time was last November, and I visited some of their farmland. And I saw how water escapes their system. In some spots, seepage from these canals bleed into idle farmland that's packed with salt cedar, an invasive species that, by the way, sucks up a lot of water. With limited resources, the tribe can't recapitalize or modernize its water system. On top of that, a law dating back to the 1790s prevents the CRWUA from leasing their water off reservation. So a lot of their water just goes to waste. Now, we can change that. My bill would allow the tribe to reduce water use on the reservation and use that water for leases or storage or conservation off the reservation. For the tribe, this bill is a pathway to more efficient farming practices, and it will allow them to invest in drip irrigation. They've been experimenting with this already, drip irrigation, demonstrating that they could get a 40% higher yield using 50% less water. For basin water users, this bill could lead to tens of thousands of acre-feet of water more that can be conserved for later use or stored in Lake Mead. Now, another thing that Congress must do is respond to the impacts of declining hydropower generation. Reservoirs across the West are storing less and less water. In Glen Canyon Dam, if Glen Canyon Dam stops generating hydropower, 5 million people, 5 million people, including rural farming communities, are going to have to pay a lot more for their electricity when they get it from another source. That's why I introduced legislation to direct the Bureau of Reclamation and the Western Area Power Administration to defray some of those higher costs for hydropower customers. Now, I'm going to keep working to get this bill across the finish line. It's very important. The federal government is asking a lot of the basin. We know that. We need the government to step up and be bold too. Congressional delegations from each of the basin states should cooperate to secure drought assistance in the next farm bill. We've already started to talk about that. And now is the time to take a serious look at augmentation projects that were once dismissed as too ambitious, like large-scale desalination plants and importing water from other basins. Now, these are ambitious ideas, I get that, but they're no more ambitious than the Hoover Dam or the Glen Canyon Dam when they were conceived. Moving water, protecting our fragile ecosystems, and learning to live and prosper during drought are not mutually exclusive. It's not mutually exclusive for our basin. Building that future for the Colorado River starts here. There is no country, and I really believe this, there is no country better at solving big engineering problems than the United States of America. We can innovate our way out of the challenges we face. All we need to do is work together. And this needs to be a shared sacrifice. And I'm looking forward to continuing that work alongside all of you. So to all of you, the Colorado River Water Users Association and Commissioner Tootin, I appreciate you inviting me here today to participate in today's conference. Thank you so much. Thank you.